Hey guys, welcome back to ARTFX Tutorial Tuesday. Last week I spoke to you about a lot of things that happened in the drop, and I made a first bass patch with Predator, Albino and Camel Fat. It's a saw wave detuned bass line and it actually sounds pretty good if you ask me, but it needs a lot more. So, damn. Today I'm gonna make another bass patch. I know a lot of you people want to see particular bass patches to be made. And I'm obviously talking about the bass patches that you hear in a lot of popular electronic music these days. And I'm talking about artists such as Skrillex, Feed Me, Kill the Noise, Knife Party, Noisia, and so many others. Everybody's trying to recreate these so-called GROWL basses. I think the easiest way to create this kind of bass lines is by using FM synthesis. Now, today I'm going to show you how FM synthesis works. What do I want to say? So first I want to thank all of you for watching my videos each week. You guys been a great help. And as you know, I want to do more blog videos, or so-called vlogs. I want to answer your questions. And with answering questions, I mean literally, you can ask anything. So, post it in the comment below, or go to my Facebook or my website or whatever, and you can ask me every kind of question that you want. Music production related questions, or video editing related questions, or maybe you want to know something more personal about me. Or maybe you have a problem in your own life and you want to talk about it, or want to have somebody else's opinion about this subject. Well, don't be afraid and just ask me, because I'm a really helpful guy and I just love to help people. So if you have a question, feel free to ask so, and I'll try to get back with a serious answer to that question. From now on, all the comments that are gonna be posted, I'm not gonna reply to them personally with a comment anymore. I might do that if I feel like, but I don't think I'm gonna answer that much comments anymore. Instead of that, I'm gonna answer by doing a video vlog. Maybe weekly, maybe daily, I don't know. I'm just gonna see that. It depends on how many questions I'm gonna get. Next week I'm going to make another bass patch. Today we're gonna make an FM bass patch, which is basically like the FM synthesis type growly bass. And next week I'm gonna make a bass that's gonna give a nice response to that growly thing. So we're gonna make a nice high pitch, lasery kind of bass, I guess. Something like that would probably work really well with this track. And there's still a lot of things to do with this tutorial. We still need to switch to the dubstep part, because I'm gonna make a dubstep switch in this track. I don't know where, I think in the second drop, somewhere around that. But basically by now we just need to make some patches and then make a drop, do some extra synth work inside the drop, then make a little breakdown, go on to the second drop, and then do an outro. And then it's time for the finishing of the track. So for now, I think it's time to move on to the tutorial.
Okay, so here we are back again with the project from last week, and this is the patch I made in the last video. So, let's get started. Today we're going to work with FM synthesis, also known as frequency modulation, a technique where an oscillator controls the frequency of another oscillator. You can hear this technique in almost any kind of heavy electronic music, so I need to talk about it today. First, I add a new MIDI track to my project, and now I can use a fancy plugin like FM8 for today's sound, but I'll be using Live's built-in operator. I drag the MIDI track in my bass group track, and then I'll rename my two bass tracks for now. I call the first one Saw Bass Detuned and the second one GROWL FM Bass. Also, don't forget to include the hashtag symbol to see the track number. So now I control click and drag the MIDI clip from last week to my new GROWL bass track, and then I add operator to this track. We're now ready to go. So I'll briefly show you how I create my GROWL basses in Operator. For more in-depth info on FM synthesis, I advise you type it in Google first. Let's play the sound first to see what we've got right now. Okay, so it sounds nothing like a GROWL yet. First thing I do is go into the MIDI clip and transpose the notes down 2 full octaves, so that's 24 semitones down. You should now hear a solid sine wave sub-bass. This is the basic sound we're going to work from. So if I now raise the level of oscillator B, the sound totally changed from a sine wave to something that sounds almost like a low-pass sol wave. Interesting, huh? Now, if I turn the level of oscillator B, you can hear the very subtle growl effect already, but it's way too soft, so let's change oscillator B a little. If you click on the sine wave image inside oscillator B, another window with a lot of vertical bars shows up. In this window you can basically create your own waveforms by adding harmonics to a current waveform. I'll show you what I mean. You heard how many that changed the final sound? I've gone from a low-pass sol wave to something which already sounds pretty growly. So for this sound I think it's easier to work with a single sustained note instead of a sequence of shorter notes. I just open up the MIDI clip, stretch the first note all the way to the end and then delete the final notes which are still there. Okay, so now I add some extra harmonics to oscillator C and then slowly raise the level to modulate the other oscillators. This brought in some of the high frequencies, which the sound was lacking a bit. Now to really bring out that formant vowel kind of bass sound, I put the chorus of oscillator C to something fairly high. Notice that it almost sounds like downsampling on a bit crusher. So now I add another oscillator to add some more harmonics to this sound. Just watch and listen very closely. Let's try a different routing setting by clicking on this part of Operator and then choosing from the several different routing systems. I'm going to use the second one since it gives this patch a little bit more grit. So now it's just a matter of playing around with the harmonics on oscillator B, C and D, who modulate the frequency of oscillator A. This can be a very time-consuming process to get everything just right, but when you have it, it is worth it. I'm constantly listening to how it sounds when I turn down the level of oscillator B, since this is the knob we're going to create the modulation with. Then after turning this knob, I might go back into one of the oscillators to change the harmonics a bit. Okay, so now it's time to group this operator in an instrument rack by selecting it and pressing Ctrl+G on my keyboard. Now we can open up the instrument rack and start setting up our macro controls. So now I go into map mode by clicking this little button, and then I map the level of oscillator B to the first macro knob. Now I can use this macro knob to control the level of oscillator B. So now I want to go into map mode again and connect the level of oscillator D to the second macro knob. This is to have more control over the added extra harmonics of the sound. Now, while still in map mode, I can change the maximum and minimum values for this knob, so that we even have more control over the added harmonics. I want the second macro knob to have a much smaller region of modulation than the first macro knob. I do this to prevent the harmonics from being gone completely and from the harmonics getting too harsh and distorted. Okay, so let's draw in some automation on these macro knobs, which is also a very time-consuming process, but I'll try to do it as quick as possible. Just watch and listen closely and you'll understand what I do. So first I make an automation of 1 beat long. Then I duplicate this automation by selecting it, then right-clicking on it, and then choosing Copy Envelope. Now I can select the part where I want to paste this and just hit Ctrl+V on my keyboard. Now I have 2 identical automations, but that is a little too simple. So I try to make the second a little different. So to make this second automation even more different, I'll introduce some more of the upper harmonics in there by automating the second macro knob. I just click the macro knob so that the automation lane appears, and then I simply draw in my automation. So now by using the drop-down menus on the right side of the automation lane, I switch back to the automation on the first macro knob. So now I want an automation twice the speed of the first 2 automations. To do this, I select the first half of the first automation, copy the envelope, and then paste it after the second automation. I'll paste it twice so I get this repeating pattern. Then finally I end it by copying the first automation again and pasting it behind the faster automation. I have now automated a 4-bar loop. So I also like to change the timing of the faster automation a bit, so that it gets a little swing. I do this by basically making the first one a bit longer and the second one a bit shorter. So now it's time to make a variation on this automation. I first make the clip the same length as the automation, and then while it's selected I press Ctrl+D to duplicate it. So now I want another fast sequence in here, which plays in a triplet timing. So I first right-click my arrangement and choose Triplet Grid all the way down at the bottom of the list. Now I select the first part of the faster automation and duplicate it over 2 more times. Now the automation repeats 3 times in a triplet pattern, and thus it ends up on the start of bar 8 of the drop, and thus it will sound right. So let's set the loop marker to loop just this part of the drop so I can start working on fattening this bass sound up a little. So I'm going to map the level of oscillator C to macro knob 3. I renamed this macro knob to formant since this brings out the formants in the sound. Now let's set the maximum values for this knob. I do this by turning the macro knob all the way up, and then I change the maximum value until it sounds good. I won't automate this yet. I'll do that in future videos. Now the first effect I add to this instrument rack is an EQ8. Also, in operator it might be good to change the amount of voices to 1. So whenever you play a next note while another note is still playing, it will cut off the note before starting the new note, if that makes any sense. With this EQ, I first take out everything below 100 Hz. I also remove some of the mid frequencies and increase the high frequencies a little. The next effect I add is a phaser. I'm going to set this phaser up to be controlled by a macro knob, so I can automate the dry wet on the phaser to bring the effect more up front if I have to. So on the phaser I raise the LFO amount to about 50%. Then I sync the rate to the project tempo and choose a slow value. Something between 2 and 4 works really well. Then I raise the feedback to make the effect more audible. This really brings out the phaser effect. I also drop the phase knob down to 0, since this controls how much the LFO modulates the stereo phase of the phaser, and since I don't want a stereo effect, I can turn this off. So now I go into map mode again, and map the dry wet on the phaser to the 4th macro knob. I call this knob phaser. Now if I play this and turn the 4th macro knob, you can hear the effect taking place. One downside to this is that when you turn the dry wet up all the way, you'll completely lose the dry signal. So how can I increase the phaser amount but still keep the dry signal intact? I'll show you. First I group the phaser in an audio effect rack by selecting it and pressing Ctrl+G on my keyboard. This audio effect rack has its own macro knobs. Now, in the audio effect rack, I make another chain below the current chain. We now have a parallel track inside our audio effect rack. The top chain is the phaser and the bottom chain is the dry signal. Okay, so now... why can't I click this? It's still connected to the macro knob on the instrument rack, I guess. How? Oh, maybe if I delete it up here in the map mode window. Ah, yes, that's better. So now, if I go to the phaser, I can simply... Oh wait, it's automatically connected to this macro knob too. Let's unmap that for now. So now to create the effect I want, I basically am going to set up my own dry-wet knob by assigning the volume sliders of the separate chains to a macro knob. But by putting the minimum and maximum value in opposite direction, I can create a dry-wet mix knob. So I'll show you how. I go into map mode inside the audio effect rack, and then I map both volume sliders to a macro knob. You could map them both to the same knob, but I like to keep them separate in case I want to do some advanced automation later in the track, or to map these to the instrument rack. I also rename my chains to phaser and dry so I can find them back easily. Now don't go out of map mode yet, but in the mapping window you want to right-click one of the map parameters and choose invert range. Now this macro knob's values are set in the opposite direction of the other macro knob's values. I also changed the amounts to 0 dB instead of 6 dB since I don't want them to go over 0 dB. So now let's see how that sounds. Oh, I forgot to turn the dry-wet of the phaser back up. If you turn the color slider up to 100%, you can really bring out the high frequencies of this sound. So now you can hear the effect. If I raise the phaser's volume, you can hear that the dry signal stays the same. So now I go into the map mode on the instrument rack and map both macro knobs in the audio effect rack to the fourth macro knob in the instrument rack. This way I can control both macro knobs at the same time from my instrument rack by turning one macro knob. Okay, so now if I turn this macro knob, the effect is going to sound different and not right. This is because this knob basically crossfades the volume of the two chains in the audio effects rack. So I go into the instrument rack's map mode and change the range for the dry chain. I want the dry chain to duck down only a couple of dB when the phaser effect kicks in. Okay, so in the phaser chain, I add an EQA to high pass the phaser chain. I do this to avoid phase cancellation in the low frequencies. So now if I raise this macro knob, you can hear that it adds a bit of subtle movement to the sound. I'm going to automate this at various points throughout the drop. So now I want to fatten this up a bit more by using my good old ARTFX. In ARTFX I first choose the multi-distort for effect slot 1. I set the type of distortion to saturation and really push the amount 1 knob very high. This really fattens up the sound without losing too much bass. For effect slot 2 I choose a cabinet. First I turn the mix all the way up and then I set the type of cabinet to Fender. Now I can play around with the bass and treble to create a nice balance between the low and mid frequencies. You can also play around with the distort to add some more grit to the sound. Then I turn the mix knob back down to blend it with the dry signal. Too much of this cabinet effect will destroy your sound and it will basically not sound good. For FX slot 3, I'll take another multi-distort, put it again in saturation mode and slowly raise amount 1. Now bring the mix down to blend it with the dry signal again. You might want to take down the amp volume a bit at this point, since it might become pretty loud. Now let's change the cabinet to the type Marshall and see how that sounds. I actually like that. The high frequencies are a little bit more clear now. Let's keep that. Okay, so now I want to check if what I just did actually improved the sound or not. So I turn off Predator FX and press play. Now when I turn it back on, you can clearly hear how much fatter it just got. So after Predator FX, I simply place another EQ8, just to take out those sub-frequencies below 100 Hz. Now I can use this same EQ to control the mid and high frequencies a little before they're going out to the bass group track. But we're not done yet. I'm going to make it even fatter with camel fat. First, in camel fat I choose the blank default preset. Then I lower the output volume a little and turn on the distortion panel. Now I slowly raise the tube amount until it sounds fat enough. I'm really pushing this very high today, almost too high if you ask me, but in this bass sound it actually sounds pretty good. Now when I raise the mag amount, it starts to become really growly, which is what we like. Now this might not be growly enough, but we can improve that later on with EQ automation or with a formant filter. I'm also going to activate the compression tab and slowly raise the amount. This squashes your bass sound, but for heavy electronic music, that can be a very helpful sound design tool. I also turn the release down all the way to get rid of that loud pop at the start of the bass sound. So that was it for this week's tutorial. Next week I'm going to make the third bass patch. This is going to be a more high pitch kind of sound, which works really well with the growly bass we created today. See you next week.